For 20 years, people in Knoxville believed they already knew what had happened to Pastor Daniel Brooks. Some called him a good man who had finally grown tired of carrying everyone else's burdens. Others quietly suggested he had disappeared because he could no longer face the financial pressure surrounding New Hope Community Church. A few insisted he had abandoned his own family without a word. Over time, those opinions settled into something that sounded almost like fact, even though no one had ever found a single piece of evidence proving any of them. The truth was that Daniel Brooks vanished on a cool spring evening in 1998, and after that day his name slowly became a question no one expected to answer. His son, Nathan Brooks, had been only 12 years old when his father disappeared. Every memory from that year remained clear even after 2 decades had passed. He remembered Sunday mornings filled with familiar routines, neighbors greeting one another by first name, church dinners where every family brought something homemade, and a father whose greatest concern always seemed to be helping someone else before thinking about himself. Daniel had earned respect throughout Knoxville because people trusted him. He never lived extravagantly, never spoke about success, and never treated faith like a performance. He believed that serving a community meant accepting responsibility even when no one noticed. That was why his disappearance shocked everyone. Police searched for weeks. Volunteers checked roads, parks, rivers, abandoned buildings, and every location suggested by anonymous phone calls. Newspapers published his photograph repeatedly. Local television stations interrupted regular programming whenever investigators announced another lead. Each new report raised hope for a few hours before ending exactly the same way. Nothing explained why Pastor Daniel Brooks had simply ceased to exist. As the investigation dragged on, uncertainty slowly turned into suspicion. Rumors spread through Knoxville faster than official information. Some claimed church donations had gone missing. Others whispered that Daniel had secretly planned to leave Tennessee. Every version sounded believable enough to survive another week, then another month, until people stopped asking whether the stories were true. They simply repeated them because everyone else did. Nathan heard those rumors everywhere. At school, classmates avoided mentioning his father directly, yet conversations always became quieter whenever he entered a room. Adults who had once smiled warmly now offered careful sympathy mixed with uncomfortable curiosity. Even ordinary errands reminded the Brooks family that people no longer saw them simply as neighbors. They had become the family whose pastor had disappeared without an explanation. Nathan's mother tried to preserve normal life, but the unanswered questions followed every decision. Financial responsibilities became heavier, familiar routines disappeared, and every birthday, Thanksgiving, and Christmas carried an empty place that no tradition could fill. Despite everything, Nathan refused to believe his father had abandoned them. The certainty remained inside him long after everyone else seemed willing to accept easier explanations. New Hope Community Church also changed. Pastor William Carter eventually assumed leadership. He spoke often about healing, moving forward, and trusting that God would reveal answers in his own time. Many members appreciated his calm presence because the congregation desperately needed stability. Beside him stood Deacon Samuel Pierce, a respected church administrator who handled finances, property matters, and nearly every important decision behind the scenes. Together they guided the church through difficult years until life gradually appeared normal again. For newer members, Daniel Brooks became little more than a name occasionally mentioned during conversations about the church's history. Nathan never accepted that kind of forgetting. As an adult, he rarely spoke publicly about his father's disappearance, yet every anniversary returned with the same quiet determination. He continued collecting newspaper clippings, police updates, and public records. Whenever investigators released even the smallest statement, Nathan saved it carefully. Every document represented one more reminder that the case remained officially unsolved. Friends sometimes encouraged him to move on. They believed holding onto unanswered questions prevented him from building a peaceful future. Nathan understood their concern, but moving forward without knowing what happened felt impossible. He was not searching for revenge. He simply wanted the truth. Whether that truth brought comfort or heartbreak no longer mattered as much as finally ending 20 years of uncertainty. By September 2018, Knoxville had changed in countless ways. Businesses had opened and closed. Families had moved away. Children who once attended Sunday school now had children of their own. Behind New Hope Community Church, however, one neglected warehouse remained standing, largely ignored because no one had found a practical use for it in years. Church leaders finally approved its demolition, describing the project as another step toward improving the property for future community programs. Construction crews arrived expecting nothing more complicated than clearing an aging structure that had long outlived its purpose. No one connected the abandoned warehouse with Pastor Daniel Brooks. No one imagined that buried beneath old concrete rested the first real answer anyone had uncovered since the spring evening when a respected pastor disappeared without leaving a single trace. The demolition stopped within minutes of the first unexpected discovery. Construction supervisors initially believed the workers had uncovered ordinary debris left beneath the old warehouse floor decades earlier. Buildings that old often concealed forgotten pipes, discarded materials, or damaged foundations. Instead, they found something that immediately required police notification. The project was suspended, the property was secured, and investigators from the Knoxville Police Department arrived before any additional concrete could be removed. Detective Olivia Grant was assigned to oversee the initial examination. She had spent years investigating cold cases and unidentified human remains, making her familiar with situations where old evidence suddenly resurfaced after decades of silence. Even so, something about the location immediately caught her attention. The warehouse stood directly behind New Hope Community Church, the same church connected to one of Knoxville's most memorable missing person investigations. Within hours, forensic specialists confirmed that the remains appeared to have been intentionally concealed beneath the concrete foundation rather than accidentally buried during construction. That distinction transformed the discovery from an unexpected construction delay into a potential homicide investigation. Olivia requested every historical file connected to the property. Old building permits, renovation records, ownership documents, maintenance reports, and archived police investigations began arriving from city offices. One file immediately stood apart from the others, carried the name Daniel Brooks. For the first time in 20 years, his disappearance officially returned to active investigation. Local news stations interrupted regular programming with breaking reports. Reporters carefully avoided announcing conclusions, but the public quickly connected the location with the pastor who had vanished in 1998. Social media filled with speculation within hours. Former church members contacted one another after years without speaking. Some admitted they had always believed Daniel had never willingly left. Others quietly apologized for believing rumors that had damaged his reputation. Nathan Brooks learned about the discovery from a coworker before seeing the television reports himself. The announcement left him unable to think about anything else. For years he had imagined receiving a phone call that might finally explain what happened to his father. Now that possibility suddenly existed, yet it brought no relief. The discovery answered nothing by itself. It merely replaced one painful question with dozens of new ones. Later that afternoon, Detective Grant contacted Nathan directly. She explained that investigators could not identify the remains immediately and that DNA testing would be required before making any official statement. She also emphasized that the investigation had only begun and asked Nathan to avoid discussing assumptions publicly while forensic examinations continued. Nathan appreciated her honesty. For 20 years, he had watched people build conclusions from rumors instead of evidence. He refused to repeat the same mistake now. Still, one detail refused to leave his thoughts. His father had disappeared without any known connection to that warehouse. If the remains truly belonged to Daniel Brooks, someone had deliberately hidden the truth only a few hundred feet from the church where he had spent years serving the community. That realization changed everything. Detective Grant assembled a team to review every interview conducted in 1998. Technology unavailable during the original investigation now allowed analysts to digitize handwritten notes, compare timelines more accurately, and identify inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed years earlier. Witness statements were reread one by one. Financial records were examined again. Property maintenance schedules from the late 1990s received renewed attention because investigators now knew the warehouse itself could no longer be ignored. One pattern slowly emerged. Several renovation projects involving church property had taken place shortly after Daniel disappeared. Most had appeared routine at the time, including repairs connected to the warehouse foundation. None of those projects had attracted suspicion during the original investigation because no one believed the building itself had any connection to the missing pastor. Now every invoice mattered. Every contractor, every payment authorization, and every construction record from 1998 became part of the investigation. Detective Grant instructed her team not to overlook even the smallest administrative detail. Cases that survived 2 decades often depended on overlooked paperwork rather than dramatic new witnesses. Meanwhile, New Hope Community Church struggled with growing public attention. Pastor William Carter released a brief statement asking members to pray for everyone affected by the renewed investigation and to respect the work of law enforcement. Deacon Samuel Pierce echoed the same message during church announcements, encouraging the congregation to avoid speculation until authorities completed their examination. Their words sounded reasonable. Many members appreciated the reminder because emotions were already running high. Others, however, quietly wondered why a warehouse connected to church property had become the center of a murder investigation after remaining untouched for so many years. Nathan listened carefully to every public statement. He noticed that everyone spoke about patience, compassion, and waiting for facts. Yet no one addressed the question occupying his own mind. If someone had hidden a body beneath church property in 1998, that act could not have happened without planning. It required time, access, and confidence that no one would ever discover the truth. For the first time since losing his father, Nathan believed the mystery might not have been created by fate. It might have been created by someone Daniel Brooks had trusted completely. Several weeks passed before the forensic laboratory completed its first major findings. Detective Olivia Grant had expected the waiting period. Advances in forensic science had made DNA identification far more reliable than it had been in 1998, but accuracy still required patience. Every sample was examined repeatedly before any conclusion could be presented to investigators or surviving family members. Nathan Brooks received another phone call from Detective Grant requesting a private meeting. This time her voice carried a different tone. She did not sound uncertain. She simply explained that the laboratory had reached a conclusion and that she wanted Nathan to hear the results directly instead of through the media. The confirmation ended 20 years of unanswered questions. The remains discovered beneath the warehouse belonged to Pastor Daniel Brooks. Nathan had prepared himself for that possibility ever since the warehouse excavation began, yet hearing the official confirmation changed everything. For 2 decades, he had lived somewhere between hope and uncertainty. Now uncertainty no longer existed. His father had never abandoned his family. He had never started a secret life somewhere else. Every rumor claiming Daniel had walked away by choice collapsed the moment forensic science established his identity. Detective Grant expressed sympathy before explaining the next stage of the investigation. Identifying the remains answered only one question. It did not explain how Daniel died, who had placed him beneath the warehouse foundation, or why the crime had remained hidden for so many years. Those questions now became the highest priority of an active homicide investigation. The official announcement reached Knoxville later that afternoon. Local television stations interrupted scheduled broadcasts once again. Newspapers published updated headlines acknowledging that Pastor Daniel Brooks had finally been identified after 20 years. Many longtime residents reacted with disbelief because they had spent years accepting explanations that now proved impossible. Others expressed regret for judging a man who had never been given the chance to defend himself. New Hope Community Church also faced renewed attention. Members gathered quietly before the next Sunday service, speaking about Daniel with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. Older members remembered his dedication to families experiencing hardship, his willingness to visit hospitals, and his habit of helping people without asking for recognition. Younger members knew him only through stories. Now those stories suddenly carried a different meaning because they belonged to a victim instead of a missing person. Pastor William Carter addressed the congregation with measured words. He acknowledged the heartbreaking identification and encouraged everyone to pray for Daniel's family while cooperating fully with investigators. Deacon Samuel Pierce delivered a similar message, emphasizing that the church would provide every document requested by law enforcement. Their statements appeared appropriate, and many members appreciated their calm leadership during another painful chapter in the church's history. Detective Grant, however, focused less on public statements than on evidence. Forensic specialists had recovered several personal items buried alongside Daniel's remains. Most had deteriorated beyond recognition after 2 decades underground, but one object survived well enough to attract immediate attention. It was a worn leather sermon notebook that investigators believed had belonged to Daniel. Nathan recognized it immediately. His father rarely traveled anywhere without carrying that notebook. It contained handwritten sermon ideas, community visits, prayer requests, meeting reminders, and personal reflections. Daniel had preferred writing everything by hand instead of relying on calendars or electronic devices. Nathan remembered watching him fill its pages night after night. Although moisture had damaged much of the notebook, forensic specialists managed to preserve portions of several pages. Many entries described ordinary pastoral responsibilities: hospital visits, counseling appointments, church committee meetings, community outreach. Nothing appeared unusual until investigators reached the final readable pages written shortly before Daniel disappeared. Those pages mentioned repeated concerns about church finances. The entries never accused anyone by name, but Daniel repeatedly referred to numbers that did not match official reports. Several notes indicated that donation records required additional review. One unfinished sentence suggested Daniel planned to discuss the discrepancies privately before making any public accusation. Detective Grant immediately requested complete financial records from the late 1990s. She also ordered investigators to compare every surviving accounting document with the references contained inside the notebook. Cases involving financial misconduct often left paper trails even when witnesses forgot important conversations. Nathan was surprised by what the notebook revealed. His father had never discussed financial concerns at home. Looking back, Nathan realized Daniel probably wanted to protect his family from unnecessary worry until he understood the situation completely. That decision reflected the kind of person his father had always been. He believed accusations required proof, not suspicion. The notebook also altered Detective Grant's understanding of the case. Until then, investigators had treated the warehouse primarily as a crime scene connected to a missing pastor. Now another possibility emerged. If Daniel had discovered serious financial irregularities shortly before disappearing, his death might not have been random. It could have been connected directly to information someone desperately wanted hidden. The investigation expanded immediately. Former church employees, accountants, finance committee members, and longtime volunteers received requests for interviews. Archived bank records were subpoenaed. Donation reports from 1998 were compared with tax filings and meeting minutes. Every financial decision made during the months before Daniel vanished became subject to renewed scrutiny. As Detective Grant organized the growing collection of evidence, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. Daniel Brooks had been asking difficult questions shortly before his disappearance, and somewhere inside the church's financial history, investigators believed they would finally discover the reason someone had ensured those questions would never be answered. Detective Olivia Grant understood that financial crimes rarely depended on a single missing receipt or one suspicious bank transfer. They revealed themselves through patterns that repeated over time. The church records from 1998 were incomplete in places, but enough documents had survived to allow investigators to reconstruct the flow of donations during the months before Pastor Daniel Brooks disappeared. The inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Several charitable donations listed in church newsletters could not be matched to bank deposits. Money reported during congregational meetings differed from amounts recorded in financial summaries prepared for internal use. None of the differences appeared large enough individually to attract immediate attention, but together they represented a substantial amount of missing money. Detective Grant requested interviews with everyone who had participated in church financial oversight during that period. Many former volunteers cooperated willingly. Some had moved away years earlier but agreed to speak by phone or video conference. Most remembered Daniel Brooks as a careful and honest pastor who insisted every donation be documented. Several also remembered that he had become unusually concerned about accounting procedures during the final weeks before he vanished. One former finance committee member recalled a meeting that had seemed insignificant at the time. Daniel had asked for supporting documents related to several building expenses. The request had not been confrontational. He simply wanted to verify that every transaction matched the church's records before presenting the annual financial report. The committee member remembered leaving the meeting believing Daniel was doing exactly what a responsible pastor should do. Another former volunteer remembered something similar. She recalled Daniel asking whether duplicate copies of donation records had been stored somewhere outside the church office. At the time, she assumed he wanted better organization. Looking back, she wondered whether he had already suspected that important documents might disappear. Those interviews strengthened Detective Grant's growing theory. Daniel Brooks had not stumbled across one isolated bookkeeping mistake. He appeared to have been conducting a careful review of church finances over several weeks. Someone had known he was asking questions, and someone had understood where those questions were leading. Nathan followed every development closely without interfering in the investigation. He continued meeting with Detective Grant whenever new information became available. During one conversation, she explained that investigators were now treating financial fraud as a possible motive behind Daniel's murder. Nathan listened quietly before mentioning something he had never considered important until now. His father had always kept personal copies of important notes. Daniel believed duplicate records protected both the church and the people serving it. If something appeared unusual, he preferred maintaining independent documentation until every question had been answered. Nathan wondered whether his father might have stored additional information somewhere outside the church before disappearing. The possibility immediately attracted Detective Grant's attention. Investigators searched through belongings returned to Nathan after the original missing person investigation. Most items contained nothing unexpected. Old family photographs, personal correspondence, sermon drafts, and routine paperwork reflected the ordinary life Daniel had lived. Then they located a small storage box that had received little attention in 1998 because it contained mostly ministry materials. Inside the box rested several folders organized by date. Most held routine church paperwork, but one envelope contained handwritten copies of donation totals and expense calculations. They were not official accounting records. Instead, they appeared to be Daniel's personal comparisons between reported income and actual deposits. The figures matched the concerns described inside the leather sermon notebook. Daniel had carefully highlighted repeated differences between money received and money officially recorded. He had written short observations beside several entries, always avoiding conclusions before additional verification. His notes reflected the same discipline that had guided his ministry. He refused to accuse anyone without evidence, yet he also refused to ignore facts that failed to make sense. One unfinished page stood apart from everything else. It listed several financial discrepancies followed by one brief reminder written in Daniel's handwriting. Meet with William and Samuel. Detective Grant read the line several times. For the first time, two names appeared directly connected to Daniel's private investigation. Pastor William Carter and Deacon Samuel Pierce had already acknowledged working closely with church finances after Daniel disappeared. But now investigators knew Daniel intended to meet both men shortly before he vanished. That discovery did not establish guilt. It did, however, establish relevance. Detective Grant immediately compared church calendars, archived meeting schedules, and surviving correspondence from that period. Records confirmed that Daniel had scheduled a private meeting during the week of his disappearance. Unfortunately, no agenda had survived, and no official minutes had ever been recorded. William Carter and Samuel Pierce were both asked to participate in formal interviews. Each agreed without hesitation. William explained that Daniel had occasionally discussed financial questions with him because church budgets required cooperation among senior leaders. He described those conversations as ordinary administrative matters and insisted he never knew of any serious disagreement. Samuel Pierce gave a similar account. He acknowledged handling many accounting responsibilities but maintained that every financial concern raised by Daniel had eventually been resolved. According to Samuel, missing documentation resulted from ordinary record-keeping problems common before widespread digital accounting systems. Their explanations sounded measured and professional. Yet Detective Grant noticed something neither man mentioned voluntarily. Neither referred to the private meeting recorded in Daniel's notes. When investigators asked specifically about that planned discussion, both men claimed they could no longer remember whether it had actually taken place. Considering that more than 20 years had passed, memory alone could not be treated as evidence. Still, the identical inability to remember one particular meeting drew Detective Grant's attention. She reviewed every interview again that evening. The financial discrepancies, Daniel's handwritten comparisons, the reminder mentioning William and Samuel, the concealed remains beneath church property, and the timing of the planned meeting no longer appeared as separate facts. They were beginning to form a single narrative. Someone had realized Daniel Brooks was getting dangerously close to uncovering the truth. Detective Grant was no longer investigating only the disappearance of a respected pastor. She was investigating the possibility that 2 decades earlier, a trusted church leader had discovered an organized scheme involving stolen donations, and before he could present his findings to the congregation, someone had ensured his voice would never be heard. Detective Olivia Grant knew that proving financial misconduct would not automatically prove murder. The law required evidence connecting motive to action, and every conclusion had to withstand scrutiny in court. The investigation therefore shifted from discovering irregularities to determining who benefited from them and who had the opportunity to silence Daniel Brooks before he exposed them. Financial analysts assigned to the case reconstructed church accounts from the mid-1990s through the early 2000s. Although some original records had disappeared, bank archives, tax filings, insurance documents, and vendor invoices allowed investigators to rebuild most of the missing history. The comparison revealed that the discrepancies noted by Daniel Brooks had not been isolated mistakes. Similar patterns appeared repeatedly over several years, involving charitable donations, maintenance budgets, and special fundraising campaigns. The money had never simply vanished. It had been redirected through payments that appeared legitimate on paper but lacked proper authorization or supporting documentation. Several expenses listed as repairs or ministry projects could not be connected to completed work. Others were approved without the signatures normally required under church policy. Detective Grant asked forensic accountants to identify everyone authorized to approve those transactions. Only a small number of people possessed that authority. Among them were William Carter and Samuel Pierce. Neither discovery established criminal responsibility by itself. Churches often relied on trusted leaders to manage finances, and many administrative decisions required flexibility. Still, the overlap between Daniel's handwritten notes and the authorization records narrowed the focus of the investigation considerably. Nathan Brooks continued cooperating whenever investigators requested assistance. He was careful not to speak publicly about names or theories. Reporters frequently contacted him, hoping he would accuse someone before formal charges existed. Nathan declined every opportunity. He had spent 20 years watching assumptions destroy his father's reputation. He refused to allow speculation to replace evidence now that the truth was finally emerging. Detective Grant appreciated his restraint. The investigation had already attracted statewide attention. Every interview, every court filing, and every public statement would eventually be examined by defense attorneys if criminal charges were filed. Emotional reactions could not substitute for documented facts. Investigators next reviewed property records connected to the warehouse. Construction permits showed that new concrete had been poured only weeks after Daniel Brooks disappeared. At the time, the work had been described as routine structural reinforcement following foundation concerns. Nothing about the paperwork had appeared suspicious in 1998 because no one suspected the warehouse had become part of a homicide. Grant requested interviews with everyone still living who had participated in that construction project. Most workers remembered very little after 2 decades. Several had retired. Others had moved to different states. One former contractor, however, remembered an unusual instruction connected to the schedule. The concrete work had been treated as unexpectedly urgent. According to his recollection, the church requested that part of the warehouse foundation be completed ahead of other planned repairs. He had considered the accelerated timeline unusual because no emergency damage had been obvious from the paperwork provided to his crew. He also remembered something else. Access to the work area had already been restricted before construction crews arrived. Church representatives handled preparations themselves, explaining that stored materials had already been removed and everything was ready for the foundation work. The contractor had accepted that explanation without question. At the time, there had been no reason to suspect anything criminal. Looking back after learning where Daniel Brooks had been found, the unusual schedule no longer seemed insignificant. Detective Grant compared that statement with church calendars from 1998. The timing aligned almost perfectly with Daniel's disappearance. She also discovered another detail that had received little attention during the original investigation. Within days after Daniel vanished, responsibility for many of his administrative duties shifted quickly to William Carter. Samuel Pierce simultaneously assumed expanded oversight of financial operations until the church selected its long-term leadership. Organizationally, those changes could be explained. A congregation needed leadership after its pastor disappeared unexpectedly. Yet when viewed alongside the financial records, Daniel's notebook, and the warehouse construction timeline, investigators saw a sequence that demanded closer examination. Search warrants were approved for additional financial material connected to William Carter and Samuel Pierce. Personal banking records, business transactions, archived correspondence, and electronic storage devices that still existed became subject to review under judicial authorization. Investigators searched for evidence that funds identified in Daniel's notes had ultimately benefited specific individuals. The first significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An archived external hard drive recovered from old church office equipment contained backup accounting files created years before cloud storage became common. Digital forensic specialists restored damaged files that had long been considered unreadable. Several spreadsheets differed from the official financial reports presented to the congregation. One version reflected actual donations received. Another reflected the reduced totals ultimately entered into official reports. The differences closely matched the handwritten calculations Daniel Brooks had preserved in his personal files. Even more important, the digital records preserved editing histories. The files identified user accounts responsible for modifying financial figures before final reports were printed. Those user accounts had been assigned to William Carter and Samuel Pierce under the church's office computer system at that time. Detective Grant remained cautious. User accounts demonstrated access, not necessarily criminal intent. Another individual could theoretically have used those computers. Nevertheless, the digital evidence independently confirmed that Daniel Brooks had been investigating real discrepancies rather than imaginary bookkeeping errors. Nathan received another update from Detective Grant. She explained that investigators now possessed enough evidence to demonstrate systematic financial manipulation inside the church during the period immediately preceding Daniel's disappearance. The remaining challenge involved proving who had decided to eliminate Daniel before he could present his findings. Nathan listened carefully before asking only one question. He wanted to know whether his father's name would finally be cleared. Grant answered without hesitation. The evidence already established that Daniel Brooks had been investigating financial irregularities, not participating in them. Every new document strengthened his reputation instead of weakening it. Whatever happened next in the criminal investigation, the false rumors that had followed Daniel for 20 years no longer survived against the growing weight of documented evidence. For Detective Olivia Grant, that realization marked an important turning point. The investigation was no longer searching for a motive. It was closing in on the people who had the strongest reason to prevent Pastor Daniel Brooks from revealing the truth. The investigation entered a new phase once prosecutors determined that the accumulated evidence justified presenting the case to a grand jury. Detective Olivia Grant understood that every witness, every financial document, and every forensic report had to be organized into a timeline that left no significant gaps. The objective was no longer to determine whether Daniel Brooks had uncovered financial misconduct. That question had largely been answered. The remaining challenge was demonstrating that the financial scheme and Daniel's murder were directly connected. The district attorney assigned experienced prosecutors to review every piece of evidence collected during the previous months. Their first conclusion was encouraging. Daniel Brooks had been completely eliminated as a suspect in the missing church funds. Every independent financial review confirmed that his handwritten calculations accurately reflected discrepancies in church accounting. Instead of participating in the missing transactions, Daniel had documented them with remarkable precision. The prosecutors then focused on motive. The evidence demonstrated that Daniel intended to confront William Carter and Samuel Pierce shortly before his disappearance. His notebook identified both men by name. His private calculations matched hidden versions of accounting files recovered from archived computer backups. Construction records established that fresh concrete had been poured in the warehouse immediately after Daniel vanished. His remains had remained hidden beneath that same concrete for 20 years. Each individual fact could be explained separately. Together, however, they formed an increasingly coherent sequence. Detective Grant arranged another round of interviews with William Carter and Samuel Pierce. Both men appeared with legal counsel. Unlike their previous conversations, neither agreed to lengthy questioning. William answered only basic identification questions before allowing his attorney to respond on his behalf. Samuel adopted the same strategy. Both denied any involvement in Daniel Brooks's disappearance and maintained that accounting inconsistencies reflected poor administrative practices rather than intentional fraud. The interviews produced almost no new information. Even so, Detective Grant noticed a significant difference. Neither man expressed surprise when informed that digital accounting records had been recovered. Neither asked what the files contained. Instead, both immediately insisted that old computer systems were unreliable and could not accurately identify who had modified financial documents decades earlier. The response attracted prosecutors' attention. The attorneys representing William and Samuel had every right to challenge the reliability of electronic evidence. Nevertheless, investigators noted that both defendants appeared more concerned about the accounting records than about the homicide investigation itself. Meanwhile, forensic accountants completed another review. They identified multiple payments issued to companies that no longer existed. Tax records showed no legitimate business activity for several of those vendors. Further investigation revealed that some addresses belonged to vacant commercial properties during the relevant years. Money intended for church ministries had apparently been diverted through non-existent contractors. Although tracing every dollar after 20 years proved impossible, investigators estimated that hundreds of thousands of dollars had disappeared through the fraudulent transactions identified in Daniel's notes and confirmed by financial reconstruction. Nathan Brooks received periodic updates from Detective Grant. He remained careful never to interfere with witnesses or investigators. Instead, he focused on preserving his father's memory within the congregation. Members who had once believed damaging rumors began approaching Nathan privately to apologize for doubting Daniel's character. Some admitted they had accepted the assumption that Daniel abandoned his family because no alternative explanation had ever seemed possible. Others confessed they had questioned his honesty after hearing repeated suggestions that financial problems surrounded his disappearance. Nathan accepted every apology with quiet dignity. He understood that most church members had also been victims of deception. They had trusted leaders who appeared respectable and compassionate. Few people naturally suspected those they worshipped beside every week. The congregation itself experienced deep division. Many longtime members struggled to reconcile the emerging evidence with the men they had trusted for decades. Others argued that the investigation should proceed wherever the facts led, regardless of anyone's reputation. Church leadership appointed an independent advisory committee to cooperate fully with law enforcement and review historical financial practices. Outside auditors were invited to examine additional records without restriction. The congregation publicly acknowledged that transparency had become essential if trust was ever to be rebuilt. Detective Grant welcomed that decision. Independent cooperation increased access to archived correspondence and committee records that had remained stored in private collections belonging to former church officials. One retired church secretary provided investigators with several appointment books from 1998. Most entries concerned routine ministry activities. One notation, however, immediately caught Detective Grant's attention. The secretary had written that Daniel Brooks requested privacy for an evening meeting with William Carter and Samuel Pierce during the week he disappeared. The meeting had been scheduled after normal office hours because Daniel wanted uninterrupted time to discuss financial matters before presenting them to church leadership. The notation ended there. No follow-up appointment had ever been recorded. Investigators compared the secretary's calendar with Daniel's notebook and recovered accounting records. Every timeline matched. Daniel had completed his financial comparisons. He had gathered supporting documentation. He had scheduled a private meeting with the two men whose user accounts later appeared in the altered accounting files. Within days, Daniel disappeared forever. The grand jury reviewed the evidence over several sessions. Witnesses testified under oath regarding financial records, construction schedules, digital forensic analysis, and the recovery of Daniel Brooks's remains beneath the warehouse foundation. After hearing the evidence, the grand jury returned sealed indictments. Detective Grant personally participated in coordinating the arrests. William Carter and Samuel Pierce were taken into custody without incident and informed that they faced charges related to financial fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Pastor Daniel Brooks. News of the arrests spread rapidly throughout Knoxville. For Nathan Brooks, the announcement carried emotions far more complicated than relief. Nothing could restore the 20 years his family had lost. Nothing could return the father who had missed every graduation, every birthday, every milestone that followed 1998. Yet, for the first time since he was 12 years old, the legal system had publicly acknowledged what he had believed despite years of doubt. His father had never abandoned his family. Daniel Brooks had remained faithful to his responsibilities until the very end, and the investigation was now prepared to prove before a court that the man remembered for his integrity had died because he refused to remain silent after discovering the truth. William Carter and Samuel Pierce entered the courtroom maintaining their innocence. Through their attorneys, both men pleaded not guilty to every charge. They denied participating in financial fraud, denied conspiring against Daniel Brooks, and denied any involvement in his death. The prosecution expected those responses. The investigation had been built with the understanding that the truth would ultimately have to be established through evidence rather than admissions. The court established a schedule for the preliminary hearings. Prosecutors began presenting the foundation of their case without revealing every piece of evidence they intended to introduce during trial. Detective Olivia Grant testified about the reopening of the investigation following the discovery of Daniel Brooks's remains beneath the warehouse foundation. She explained how forensic specialists identified the remains through DNA comparison with Nathan Brooks, and how the subsequent investigation expanded into the church's financial records. Defense attorneys challenged nearly every conclusion. They argued that 20-year-old evidence should be viewed cautiously. They questioned witness memories, criticized incomplete financial records, and suggested that the prosecution was attempting to connect unrelated events into a single theory. They emphasized that no eyewitness had ever claimed to see William Carter or Samuel Pierce harm Daniel Brooks. The prosecution did not dispute that point. Instead, prosecutors explained that many homicide convictions relied upon carefully connected circumstantial evidence supported by forensic findings, financial documentation, digital records, and witness testimony. Their argument rested on the consistency of the evidence rather than on any single dramatic discovery. Outside the courtroom, Nathan Brooks continued avoiding public accusations. He accepted invitations from several churches to speak about perseverance, but he refused to discuss details that remained before the court. Whenever reporters asked whether he believed William Carter and Samuel Pierce were guilty, Nathan answered that the evidence should speak for itself. His restraint earned increasing respect. Members of the original congregation who had once viewed him only as the son of a missing pastor now recognized how carefully he had protected both the investigation and his father's reputation. Detective Grant continued working alongside prosecutors even after the arrests. Additional witnesses were located through renewed public attention surrounding the case. Some individuals who had remained silent for years now realized that information they once considered insignificant might help explain what happened in 1998. One former church employee contacted investigators voluntarily. She explained that during the weeks before Daniel disappeared, he had appeared unusually determined to complete an internal financial review before the next meeting of church leadership. He never suggested that anyone should be publicly accused without proof, but he repeatedly emphasized that every dollar donated by the congregation belonged to the ministries it supported. According to her recollection, Daniel believed transparency protected everyone involved. She also remembered something she had never reported because it had seemed meaningless at the time. Shortly before Daniel vanished, she overheard William Carter expressing frustration that Daniel was making routine bookkeeping far more complicated than necessary. She could not remember the complete conversation, but she remembered the tone because Daniel rarely created conflict with anyone. The testimony did not establish criminal conduct. It did, however, reinforce the growing picture that disagreement over church finances had become increasingly serious before Daniel disappeared. Another witness came forward after seeing television coverage of the arrests. He had served on a temporary building committee during the warehouse renovation. Reviewing old personal papers after hearing about the investigation, he found handwritten meeting notes from 1998. Among ordinary construction discussions appeared one unexpected sentence. The warehouse foundation work had been approved before the committee formally reviewed competing contractor proposals. That violated normal church procedure. Large construction expenses ordinarily required committee discussion and documented approval. Yet in this instance, the work moved forward unusually quickly, with much of the administrative process completed afterward instead of beforehand. Investigators compared those notes with recovered financial documents. The dates aligned precisely with the emergency construction timeline already established through permits and contractor testimony. The prosecution added the witness to its growing list. Meanwhile, forensic specialists completed one final examination of Daniel Brooks's personal effects. His clothing and remaining belongings had suffered extensive deterioration after 2 decades beneath concrete. Even so, laboratory analysis confirmed there was no evidence supporting the theory that Daniel had voluntarily disappeared. Everything recovered remained consistent with the conclusion that his body had been deliberately concealed shortly after his death. That finding became another important element of the prosecution's case. Daniel Brooks had not left Knoxville. He had not abandoned his ministry. He had not started another life under a different identity. Every scientific examination supported the conclusion that his disappearance ended during the same period in which the church's financial scheme faced its greatest threat of exposure. Nathan attended every court proceeding permitted under Tennessee law. He never attempted to influence witnesses or address the media after hearings. Instead, he listened carefully as investigators, accountants, forensic specialists, and former church members described the father he had remembered throughout his life. Again and again, the testimony reached the same conclusion. Daniel Brooks had approached financial concerns methodically. He insisted upon documentation. He avoided public accusations. He intended to resolve problems through proper church leadership before involving outside authorities. Those consistent descriptions strengthened the prosecution's argument regarding motive. Daniel represented a danger not because he acted recklessly, but because he was close to uncovering systematic financial theft while possessing the credibility to convince the congregation once his investigation was complete. As preparations for trial continued, prosecutors organized the evidence into a chronological presentation. They intended to begin with Daniel's discovery of financial discrepancies, continue through his private documentation and scheduled meeting with William Carter and Samuel Pierce, establish the suspicious warehouse construction immediately after his disappearance, present the concealment of his remains beneath the newly poured concrete, demonstrate the manipulation of church accounting records, and conclude with the forensic recovery that finally exposed what had remained hidden for 2 decades. Detective Grant reviewed the completed trial outline with the prosecution team. For the first time since human remains had been discovered beneath the warehouse, she believed the investigation had reached the point where every major question had an evidence-based answer. There were still legal arguments to be resolved and witnesses to be examined before a jury, but the narrative was no longer built upon suspicion. It rested upon documented financial records, digital forensic analysis, construction timelines, scientific identification, independent witness testimony, and Daniel Brooks's own handwritten investigation. Nathan realized that the approaching trial would never erase the years his family had lost. It would never return birthdays, holidays, or ordinary conversations that disappeared with his father in 1998. Yet it offered something his family had waited more than 20 years to receive: the opportunity for the truth to be examined openly under oath before a court of law, so that Daniel Brooks would finally be remembered not as a man who abandoned his calling, but as a pastor who remained faithful to his principles until the very end. The trial began nearly 21 years after Daniel Brooks disappeared. By then, countless assumptions had hardened into accepted history, and many people believed the truth could never be reconstructed. The prosecution entered the courtroom knowing that the passage of time would become one of the defense's strongest arguments. Their responsibility was to demonstrate that evidence could remain reliable even when memories faded. The jury selection process received careful attention from both sides. Attorneys questioned prospective jurors about their understanding of circumstantial evidence, financial crimes, and delayed homicide investigations. Once the jury was seated, the proceedings moved steadily into opening statements. The prosecution outlined a straightforward sequence. Daniel Brooks discovered significant financial irregularities within the church. He documented every discrepancy before accusing anyone. He arranged a private meeting with William Carter and Samuel Pierce because he believed church leaders deserved the opportunity to explain the inconsistencies. Instead of resolving the matter, Daniel disappeared. Within days, a section of the church warehouse received an unusually accelerated concrete foundation. 20 years later, Daniel's remains were recovered beneath that same foundation, while financial records, digital evidence, and witness testimony established the motive behind his murder. The defense offered a different interpretation. Its attorneys argued that the prosecution had assembled unrelated events into a compelling story without direct eyewitness testimony. They insisted that missing financial records did not prove homicide, that construction schedules did not identify a killer, and that old electronic files could not conclusively establish who had altered accounting documents decades earlier. Over the following weeks, the jury heard testimony from dozens of witnesses. Detective Olivia Grant explained how the investigation had been reopened after construction workers uncovered human remains beneath the warehouse. Forensic anthropologists described the recovery process and the scientific methods used to identify Daniel Brooks through DNA comparison with Nathan Brooks. Digital forensic specialists demonstrated how archived computer backups preserved accounting changes despite the passage of 20 years. Financial experts carefully explained the fraudulent payment system. Using charts, bank records, invoices, and tax filings, they showed how donations intended for church ministries had been diverted through companies that performed no legitimate work. They demonstrated how Daniel's handwritten notes corresponded with accounting discrepancies that independent experts later verified through recovered electronic records. Former church employees testified that Daniel had become increasingly concerned about financial accountability during the weeks before his disappearance. They described him as patient, careful, and unwilling to accuse anyone without documentation. Several recalled that he repeatedly emphasized that honesty protected both the church and its members. Nathan Brooks testified near the end of the prosecution's case. His testimony focused less on legal evidence than on the personal consequences of his father's disappearance. He described growing up believing that Daniel had not abandoned his family despite hearing rumors repeated throughout the community. He explained how his mother struggled to rebuild their lives while carrying unanswered questions for 2 decades. He never attempted to express anger toward the defendants. Instead, he spoke about his father's character. He explained that Daniel believed trust could never exist without accountability, and that faith meant telling the truth even when the truth carried personal risk. Nathan admitted that no verdict could restore the years his family had lost, but he hoped the trial would finally replace rumor with fact. His testimony left a lasting impression on everyone present in the courtroom. The defense cross-examined each witness carefully, searching for inconsistencies created by the passage of time. Although minor differences appeared in recollections of dates and conversations, the central facts remained remarkably consistent. Independent witnesses who had never met each other described the same pattern of financial concern, the same scheduled meeting, and the same unusual construction timeline immediately after Daniel disappeared. After both sides rested, attorneys presented their closing arguments. The prosecution reminded jurors that crimes committed in secrecy rarely produced eyewitnesses. Instead, justice often depended upon assembling independent facts that pointed toward the same conclusion. Every significant category of evidence in the case, financial documents, digital records, forensic science, construction history, and witness testimony, supported one another without contradiction. The defense urged jurors to focus on reasonable doubt. They argued that assumptions had replaced certainty and warned against convicting individuals based upon a tragic sequence of events rather than direct proof. The jury began deliberations. Nathan waited with his family, knowing that the outcome rested entirely with 12 citizens who had devoted weeks to examining every detail. Detective Grant returned to her office but remained available should the court request clarification regarding any exhibits. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom became silent as the foreperson stood. The verdict found William Carter and Samuel Pierce guilty of conspiracy, financial fraud, and the murder of Daniel Brooks. Neither man spoke after the verdict was announced. The judge thanked the jurors for their careful service before scheduling sentencing. During the later sentencing hearing, the court imposed lengthy prison terms reflecting both the homicide and the extensive financial crimes that had betrayed the congregation's trust. The judge observed that the defendants had not only taken a man's life, but had also allowed an innocent family to live beneath suspicion for more than 20 years. Following the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, the church undertook significant reforms. Independent financial oversight became permanent. Annual external audits were required. Financial reports were made available to every member of the congregation. New leadership publicly acknowledged the failures that had allowed deception to remain hidden for so long and committed themselves to rebuilding trust through openness rather than authority. A memorial service for Daniel Brooks was held after the legal process ended. This time, the gathering was no longer shadowed by uncertainty. Those who attended remembered him not as a missing pastor whose fate remained unknown, but as a man whose integrity survived every false accusation placed upon his name. Former church members who had once believed the rumors stood beside those who had defended him from the beginning. Many quietly admitted that they wished they had asked more questions years earlier instead of accepting convenient explanations. Nathan visited his father's grave after the sentencing became final. He realized that justice had arrived too late to change the hardest parts of his family's story. His father would never watch grandchildren grow up, celebrate family milestones, or continue the ministry he had loved. Those losses could never be measured by any courtroom decision. Yet something equally important had finally been restored. Daniel Brooks's name no longer carried suspicion. His life, his character, and his final act of courage had been recognized by the very system that had once lacked the evidence to protect him. The truth had survived years of silence because facts, patiently preserved and honestly examined, possess a quiet strength that deception can never permanently erase. As Nathan left, he carried no desire for revenge. He carried gratitude for investigators who refused to abandon forgotten evidence, for witnesses who finally found the courage to speak, and for ordinary jurors who patiently followed the facts wherever they led. He understood that justice does not erase suffering, but it can restore dignity to those whose voices were taken from them. In the end, Daniel Brooks left behind something greater than a solved case. He left a reminder that integrity often demands courage long before anyone knows the outcome, that truth may disappear beneath layers of fear, lies, and passing years, yet it remains waiting to be uncovered by those willing to seek it with honesty and perseverance. A good name may be buried by falsehood for a season, but when people refuse to stop searching for the truth, even decades of silence cannot prevent light from reaching what was hidden, and that light has the power not only to expose injustice, but also to restore hope for everyone who still believes that doing what is right is never truly in vain. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us today and for staying until the very end of this story. Your support, your curiosity, and your willingness to listen mean more to us than words can truly express. Every story we share is created with the hope that it will not only entertain but also inspire reflection, compassion, and a deeper appreciation for the strength of the human spirit. The journey you have just experienced reminds us that truth may be delayed, but it should never be abandoned. Lies can sometimes hide reality for years, and injustice may seem to prevail for a long time. Yet honesty, perseverance, and courage have a remarkable way of bringing hidden truths into the light. It also teaches us that a person's reputation is precious, and we should never rush to judge others without knowing the full story. Sometimes, the greatest act of justice is simply refusing to give up on the search for the truth. We sincerely hope this story has touched your heart and left you with something meaningful to carry into your own life. If it encouraged you, moved you, or gave you a new perspective, then our work has achieved its purpose. If you would like to support our channel, there is a very simple way to help. Please take a moment to click the like button, share your thoughts or feelings in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement not only motivates us to continue creating meaningful stories, but also helps these stories reach more people who may need hope, encouragement, or a reminder that truth and kindness still matter. Thank you once again for being part of our community. We are truly grateful for your support, and we look forward to sharing many more heartfelt stories with you. Until next time, take care of yourself, cherish the people you love, never stop believing in the power of truth, and always remember that even the smallest act of integrity can leave a lasting impact on someone's life.